Hi, I have with me today Indiana State Representative Chyung from House District 15. Welcome, Representative Chyung.
Thank you for having me.
So how has COVID-19 impacted you or Indiana?
Well, here in Indiana, I live in Lake County, and that's the district I represent. It's the second worst county in the state of Indiana out of all 92. The first being Marion County, where the city of Indianapolis is located. So obviously we're paying very close attention to the numbers every day. Things are changing in terms of what research comes out, in terms of how people are reacting to this. And with this being the autumn and the school season starting to begin, there's renewed concerns about how this can spread in schools, if virtual learning is an option for parents who need to go back to work, and then a lot of pitched battles with teachers being put in unsafe situations and some school districts not having enough PPE. So it's been quite a lot of stress, quite a lot of, the situation is still here, the pandemic is still here, it's not gone away. And we're hoping that we can fight harder and fight better to get rid of this thing in the fall and make sure that people are staying safe. And then in my own district, specifically in Lake County, we've had a number of nursing homes that have been pretty hard hit. And at the beginning of the pandemic, it wasn't especially an issue because I had constituents calling me saying, I have loved ones in this nursing home facility, and I can't get answers out of the management there as to if there's cases, if there's been exposures. I can't get in touch with my relative. Obviously, on-site visits are banned, and it was pretty chaotic at the beginning. So we called on the governor, me and a few other representatives called on the governor to release that data through our health agency. And eventually they relented and did release that to the public. So I'm proud we could bring a little bit more transparency, but by all measures, we are just in the middle of the eye of this hurricane.
What are some of the efforts that Lake County or Indiana are taking to address this pandemic?
So I think it was around 2 or 3 weeks ago, we instituted a countywide and then a statewide mask mandate for people who are out in public and not able to socially distance. We weren't one of the earlier states to implement a mandate, but we're also not one of the later states who have still not put in place mask mandates. And it's still a piecemeal approach across the government, across the states, in how they're approaching this. So it makes it very difficult to nail down where the outbreaks happen and where these flare up. And we're consulting with our experts, honestly. I am not a health expert. I'm not, my background is not in medical science. I'm not a professional in this field. And I think more politicians like myself need to have the willingness to open up their minds, admit when they're wrong, and defer to the experts in this scenario to save as many lives as possible.
And have you seen any policies that have been successful, as well as policies that really didn't work out?
In the state of Indiana, yeah, I definitely think so. Not only the lack of transparency behind the nursing home deaths, which gave so much heartache to the folks who have loved ones in those facilities, whether it's a parent or a grandparent or a great-grandparent, anyone who couldn't hear from their loved ones was definitely a big failure. And now that we're seeing this data start to trickle out from these facilities, we're seeing that they're accounting for sometimes as much as 40% of the deaths in a county or in a specific region are due to what's happening in the assisted living facilities. With the aging population as well, it's been written about extensively. They call it the silver tsunami of aging folks, baby boomers, who are going to be getting out of the workforce and getting into these facilities and living longer than ever, thanks to medical technology and those advancements. It's an extremely worrisome battle as to how we're going to approach assisted living facility regulation moving forward. There's also just a lot of uncertainty because I feel like the state and the federal government, to that effect, are unwilling to make judgments on some of these scenarios. Like a lot of the local officials, the local school boards that I've talked to, the local municipal elected officials, city councils and mayors are trying to find an expert, a public health expert, to defer their decision making to. So sometimes county health offices don't have any resources and don't have experts around viral pandemics. Sometimes state health officials are unwilling to make judgments saying you are in the right zone, you are in the middle zone, you are in the wrong zone, because politically it has gotten so charged around what kind of decisions you make and what kind of judgments you lay down. The level of discourse is so toxic. People are getting very angry at each other and very angry at government and institutions and the public school systems for what I don't perceive as good reasons at all. So the lack of people wanting to say, yes, it's good, no, it's not good, is making it really difficult for us to do our jobs as well.
And what about economic activity? Has that resumed in Indiana?
Yeah, so we've had $1 billion shortfall and counting due to uncollected tax revenue. Our school system is run heavily in part by income taxes, which is unique, or sales taxes rather, excuse me, which is unique to the state of Indiana. And most other states do a combination of property taxes and are heavily funded local schools by property taxes. Because we have constitutional property tax caps in the state of Indiana, that lost revenue comes up from the sales tax side. Obviously, with the pandemic going on, sales tax revenue has plummeted, with businesses being forced to shut down, with travel being mostly halted in the height of the summer tourism season, with a lot of uncertainty out there over if college towns are going to be able to come back, if downtowns are going to be able to come back, with the civil unrest happening mainly in the downtowns as well. It's not painting a good picture for us at all. So locally in my own district, I found that even though we're in the suburban Chicago area, we're kind of an exurb. We're kind of far out, like about an hour or so driving. So we haven't felt the effects as if we were inside the metro urban core of Chicago. Like, those businesses have been boarded up for weeks. And here in my own district, things are kind of getting back to normal a little bit more quickly, but with the uncertainty of the pandemic, that could change tomorrow.
So, shifting gears, according to Stop AAPI Hate, there have been over 2,000 reports of hate incidents against Asian Americans in the wake of COVID-19. Have you seen any of this in Indiana?
So thankfully, I haven't been leaving my house very much, so I haven't been verbally accosted or anything like that. I mean, I'm going to start the campaign season pretty soon, so I'm sure something will happen. I fully expect some kind of racism instance to happen. It happened to me in 2018, and that was without a pandemic and without all the economic uncertainty that a pandemic brought. So I haven't had any personal instances happen to myself or to my family. However, yes, I've also heard about the myriad instances that people in other parts of the country have been dealing with, calling this Wuhan virus or China flu, saying Chinese and Asian people like to eat bats and dogs, and that's why this thing originated, when the medical science is still not clear and the origins of this pandemic are still very unclear, and that's a very mean-spirited thing to say. I think that we've all got to let cooler heads prevail when we come to talking about this virus and talking about its origins. We don't need to be trying to scapegoat people. I think that's kind of what the political climate is demanding, and that's why people are resorting to racism. There's this need to scapegoat, and there's this desire to point out a visible, very clear-cut enemy, because people don't like uncertainty. Humans are naturally creatures who do not like uncertainty. And the fact that this is a virus that no one really knows anything about and you obviously cannot see makes it more of a motivator for some of those folks to point out people wrongly who they want to blame.
So you touched a little bit on some of the results of the protests, but worldwide, people have seen the death of George Floyd and the resulting protests. How has your community reacted?
My community has been a pretty mixed bag, quite honestly. I've been, like I said, we're in the Chicago regional market, so you've got a suburban, exurban, and I've got a few rural precincts in my area as well. So you've got a really wide cross-section of people who are way to the left politically, way to the right politically, and then just all over. So in some instances, we've seen some protests supportive of criminal justice reform and supportive of the Black Lives Matter movement in my own community, in towns in my own community, which, to give you some perspective, my district is more than 90% white. So that's pretty shocking in my area, in my part of the state, in such a place like Indiana. However, on the other hand, we've also seen just as many counter protests, pro-police, pro-Second Amendment, pro-libertarian, pro-right-wing protests as well in response to the Black Lives Matter movement. So I would just say it's super divided politically. I think, and the sad part is I think there's so much more consensus around what we all actually believe in at our core. No, we don't think racism, I think everyone for the most part agrees that racism is not good and that there should be some reforms made around criminal justice in order to advance society forward. But both fringes kind of get wrapped up in the extremes and the rhetoric of, defund, being a hardline defund the policer, or being a hardline like all lives matter person. There's so much more in the middle that we ultimately do all agree with, that it's just causing a lot of distress across the country and in my own community.
And so what outcomes do you hope to see or achieve?
Well, in the upcoming legislative session, I hope that we'll have an honest dialogue about policing reform and criminal justice reform. These are all things that, for example, the Indiana Black Legislative Caucus for years in the state of Indiana and in the General Assembly has been pushing for reforms around racially motivated pretextual stops. For like, if a cop stops if a police officer pulls over somebody and race is determined to be a motivating factor for that stop, those kinds of things don't have a place in modern society. And I'm hoping that we can have a real dialogue moving forward about how to make sure that we obviously don't want to protect crooked cops or people who are dishonest or people who are committing outright crimes like some of these national figures have shown, but we also want to make sure that the solution we come out with on the other end doesn't leave it so that when you dial 911, there's nobody on the other line to respond to your emergency. And I'm optimistic, but I'm hoping that we can, if we have a little bit more common sense rhetoric and a little bit more patience and a little bit more willingness to talk to the folks who are on the other side of the issue with you, then that we can make some reforms in the upcoming legislative session.
The current COVID-19 pandemic and Black Lives Matter movement has changed the state of the world drastically. What do you think is required of the United States and of the world going forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think that I think our political leaders, for one, need to learn to speak like adults, for one. I think that it's kind of clear that the politicians, and I'm a politician as well, so I guess I'm calling the kettle black, that we don't know a good way to discuss these issues with each other. It's become so polarized because of the current rhetoric, because of national figures leading the political charges against one another, and the fact that we're in probably the most heated election year in modern history, and we're less than 90 days away from one of the most consequential elections of modern history. So I think that the political leaders really need to engage with their communities. You have to be super accessible as a politician and have an open mind about this stuff. Like, be willing to go into situations where you're uncomfortable and where you might hold the minority viewpoint and just say, where can we find areas to agree on? I don't agree with you on this, but what about this? And keep trying over and over to build that consensus, because ultimately, if we don't listen to one another and we keep having these movements over and over, the movement itself is a symbolic victory, but if we don't have any real policy or legislative change or government reforms, then we haven't really advanced the ball at all. So hoping that we can, as politicians, open up our minds and open up our ears to people, and hopefully once this election is over, maybe things will cool down, but maybe not. So I don't know. We'll see.
Those are some very good points, though. So what do you see as the overall challenges in the 2021 legislative session in Indiana?
Well, it's going to be another budget year for us. We pass a biennial budget in every odd year. So in 2021, not only will the budget be top of mind, but also redistricting as a result of the census, a once-in-a-decade battle for the new maps that will determine control of the General Assembly. In the state of Indiana, we still have partisan redistricting, so it's done entirely by the General Assembly and signed into law by the governor, like any other law that we pass. So this election is especially consequential for the state house and state senate in our state because of that control and because of the fact we don't have independent redistricting yet. Not only that, but add on top of, we don't know what's going to happen in November, who's going to win the presidential election, and what kind of era that's going to bring in come January. So is our response to COVID going to get worse? Is it going to get better? Is it going to get mingled with the flu season and insert more uncertainty and economic pain into the economy when winter rolls around? Is there going to be a vaccine by then that can be mass produced? We don't have answers to any of these questions yet. So in the upcoming legislative session, it will be a free-for-all as to what kinds of battles we'll be pursuing. And I am a proponent of independent redistricting. I don't like the fact that even though one party might get 51% of the votes statewide in Indiana in 2018, they win 67% of the seats in the state house in the exact same election. So there's a giant gap there statistically about how your vote counts, if your vote really matters, and if votes are counted equally, because the pure fact is that it doesn't if you live in one of these solid blue or solid red districts. Now, my district myself is right on the bubble. It's around 50% and leans more towards the conservative side. So I, as a Democrat, have to kind of thread the needle to make sure that I can build consensus. And that forces me to be a better legislator, quite honestly. It forces me to listen to people. Other detractors might say that it doesn't allow me to move progress as quickly and as forcefully as I would like, because I have to take into account everyone's views. But I found that people nowadays, their number one kind of gripe about what's going on boils down to the fact that they do not trust the political system. They do not trust their politicians. They do not trust institutions like government. They think there's a lot of corruption behind the scenes, and there's a lot of laws that inspire politicians to act poorly. And I would agree with them on a lot of situations, quite honestly. I've proposed a number of reforms myself to restrict legislators a little more. But when you have these competitive districts, when you have areas where where legislators are forced to listen to everybody because the upcoming election will be so competitive, it makes you better at your job. And I think in the long term benefits everybody more so than having a super polarized 90-10 or 80-20 district.
Right. And so what are some of the bills or initiatives you're planning to move forward next session?
That's a great question. So with the pandemic and with the residual effects of COVID, affordable housing was one thing that we were trying to have a conversation about in the last session as well. For a lot of folks outside of Indiana, they might not think of our state as a place that has really severe affordable housing needs, just because we're in the middle of the state, we're not on the coast, we're not really growing like Silicon Valley or like New York City or some of these other, Northern Virginia, some of these other corridors, Austin, Texas, Colorado. So we wouldn't have those kinds of needs. But the fact is that out of the top 20 cities with the highest eviction rates, 3 of those are in the state of Indiana. Our wages have simply not kept up, even though the cost of living is low as well. And our eviction laws are pretty punitive and pretty pro-landlord compared to other states. So I worked on that priority last session as well, to make sure that we could build some consensus around the landlord community and the tenant community. We came up a little short in the reforms that we wanted. The governor did veto one of the bills that we had sent to him we actually liked. I didn't vote for it, so I was happy that the governor exercised his veto power. And in the middle of a pandemic, it would have given landlords even more sprawling rights to evict people, which was not the right political move to make. So we're hoping that we can make some progress around affordable housing law and make some kinds of reforms there. Additionally, I'm on the Financial Institutions Committee in the House, so payday lending and short-term lenders have always come up as a battle year after year that we've had to fight. Everybody ultimately in the end wants to extend credit to people who can't afford it, but the means by which you accomplish that is the point of disagreement. Whereas the industry would say you need to charge really high triple-digit interest rates in order to recoup the risk and recoup your losses that comes with lending to a economically disadvantaged sector of society. Whereas on the other side, the consumer advocates would say, this is not the way to do it. This is just a debt trap. This would be more punitive towards people who are trying to climb the economic ladder. What other reforms can we make instead? So I'm hoping that we can, again, find some consensus. In my last two sessions, we killed the worst of the payday lending bills that I didn't see that were good for consumers, but they're going to be back again. Every year they are, and we'll hopefully be able to tamp that down and create a solution that works for both parties and that is not too extreme in terms of raising lending costs to people.
Best of luck, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Irene.